The world has always been fascinated by notorious killers. Some names dominate headlines, documentaries, and endless online discussions, creating the illusion that they represent the darkest chapters in a nation's history. But behind the viral stories lies a far more unsettling truth. In Canada, some of the most horrifying crimes ever committed have slowly faded from public memory, overshadowed by newer cases and sensational media coverage. Yet for the families who lost loved ones, the pain never disappeared. Their nightmares never ended, even when the camera stopped rolling. Tonight, we journey into those forgotten shadows. This isn't a story about one infamous criminal, it's about a series of monsters whose actions scarred communities, shattered trust, and forever changed the country's history. Each left behind a trail of grief, fear, and unanswered questions. As we move deeper into this journey, you'll discover that sometimes the most terrifying names are not the ones everyone remembers, but the ones history quietly buried beneath the headlines. Long before social media amplified every tragedy, organized crime was already writing its own bloody chapters. Among its most feared figures was a man whose loyalty belonged not to justice, but to violence. Serving as an enforcer for a notorious motorcycle gang, he transformed murder into a routine assignment, carrying out killings with chilling precision over more than a decade. Lives disappeared one after another, many connected to criminal rivalries, yet every victim left behind families forced to live with unbearable silence. Unlike impulsive killers driven by rage or obsession, his violence was calculated and systematic. Death became another tool used to maintain power, send warnings, and eliminate perceived threats. The staggering number of victims painted a grim picture of how organized crime could quietly spread terror beyond public view. His legacy remains a haunting reminder that evil doesn't always seek attention, it often thrives in secrecy, protected by fear and silence. In the early 1990s, Canada was horrified by a couple whose appearance couldn't have been more deceiving. To outsiders, they looked ordinary, even charming. But behind closed doors existed unimaginable cruelty. Together, they manipulated, abused, and murdered young women, turning trust into a weapon. Their crimes shocked the nation not only because of their brutality, but because they revealed how easily evil can hide behind a smiling face. The deepest wound came from within their own family. One victim was the woman's younger sister, a tragedy so heartbreaking it forever changed public perception of the case. Court proceedings captivated the nation, but the controversy didn't end when the trials were over. Years later, one of the perpetrators returned to society under a new identity, igniting fierce public debate about justice, forgiveness, and whether some crimes should ever be forgotten. Even decades later, the case continues to provoke anger, heartbreak, and difficult questions that remain unanswered. Hospitals and nursing homes are places where people expect compassion, healing, and dignity. Families entrust doctors and nurses with the lives of those they love most, believing they are in safe hands. But in one of Canada's most disturbing betrayals of trust, that belief was shattered. A nurse, respected by colleagues and relied upon by vulnerable patients, secretly used her position to end lives instead of protecting them. For years, elderly residents in long-term care facilities died under circumstances that seemed natural. Few imagined someone responsible for their care was deliberately causing their deaths through lethal insulin injections. Even more disturbing was the revelation that warning signs had surfaced long before authorities acted. Confessions reportedly made on multiple occasions failed to trigger immediate investigations, allowing the tragedy to continue. The scandal forced Canadians to confront uncomfortable truths about accountability within healthcare and exposed dangerous weaknesses in a system designed to protect society's most vulnerable. Few crimes strike deeper fear than those involving children. During the early 1980s, communities across British Columbia were gripped by panic as young people began disappearing. Parents checked windows twice before bedtime. Playgrounds fell unusually quiet. Every unfamiliar face became a source of suspicion. Somewhere, a predator was hunting the innocent, leaving investigators racing against time while families desperately searched for answers that often never came. The man eventually identified as responsible became one of Canada's most infamous serial killers, convicted of murdering numerous children and teenagers within an astonishingly short period. His psychological profile revealed an extraordinary lack of empathy and remorse, traits consistent with extreme psychopathy. But psychological labels could never explain the devastation left behind. Every victim represented stolen dreams, grieving families, and communities forever transformed by fear. Long after his conviction, his crimes continued to serve as a painful reminder that the greatest monsters often appear completely ordinary, until it's far too late. On an ordinary spring afternoon in 2018, one of Toronto's busiest streets transformed into a scene of unimaginable horror. Pedestrians moved through their daily routines, unaware that within moments their lives would be changed forever. A rented van suddenly accelerated into the crowd, turning sidewalks into a place of panic and devastation. In mere seconds, 10 innocent people lost their lives, while many others were left with life-altering injuries. The randomness of the attack made it especially terrifying. There was no warning, no chance to escape, only chaos unfolding in broad daylight before countless horrified witnesses. As investigators searched for answers, they uncovered a disturbing motive rooted in an online extremist ideology fueled by resentment and hatred. The attack quickly became more than a criminal investigation. It exposed the dangers of digital communities capable of encouraging violence in the real world. It forced governments, law enforcement, and society to confront uncomfortable questions about radicalization on the internet and the devastating consequences when hatred moves from computer screens to crowded city streets. For years, men from Toronto's LGBTQ+ community began disappearing without explanation. Many were immigrants, newcomers, or individuals living quiet, private lives, making their disappearances easier to overlook. Families waited for phone calls that never came, while friends reported missing loved ones with growing frustration. As months turned into years, fear spread throughout the community, accompanied by painful accusations that these disappearances were not receiving the urgency they deserved. Confidence in the system slowly began to erode. When police finally arrested an elderly landscaper, the investigation uncovered one of the darkest serial murder cases in modern Canadian history. The victims had been specifically targeted because they were vulnerable and isolated, leaving many to question whether earlier intervention could have saved lives. The case sparked widespread discussions about discrimination, systemic failures, and the responsibility of law enforcement to protect every community equally. Beyond the headlines, it became a painful reminder that justice delayed can sometimes carry an unimaginable human cost. December 6, 1989, began like any other day at Montreal's École Polytechnique. Students attended lectures, discussed assignments, and looked forward to their futures as engineers. Then, without warning, an armed man entered the building. He separated the women from the men before opening fire, targeting female students simply because of their gender. Within 20 terrifying minutes, 14 women were murdered, and many others were wounded, leaving an entire nation struggling to comprehend an act of hatred so deliberate and so cruel. The massacre forever changed Canada's conversation about violence against women. Families mourned daughters, sisters, and friends whose dreams ended in an instant, while survivors carried emotional scars that would last a lifetime. In the years that followed, public advocacy inspired significant debates surrounding firearm legislation and women's safety. Every anniversary serves as a solemn reminder that hatred, when left unchecked, can produce unimaginable tragedy, and that remembering the victims remains just as important as remembering the crime itself. If there is one case that continues to haunt Canadian criminal history above almost all others, it is the investigation surrounding a secluded pig farm in British Columbia. At first glance, it appeared to be an ordinary rural property. But beneath the quiet landscape, investigators would uncover evidence pointing toward years of unimaginable violence. Missing women, many from vulnerable backgrounds, had vanished with little explanation, their families desperately searching for answers while hope slowly faded with every passing day. The investigation became the largest serial killer inquiry in Canadian history, stretching over several years and costing millions of dollars as forensic teams painstakingly searched the property for evidence. Disturbing allegations surrounding the disposal of victims' remains shocked the public and fueled countless rumors that remain associated with the case even today. Beyond the horrifying details, the investigation exposed painful failures in how missing persons cases involving marginalized women had been handled. It became not only the story of a serial killer, but also a national reckoning over whose lives society chooses to protect. Looking back across these tragedies, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Evil rarely follows a single pattern. Sometimes it hides behind organized crime, sometimes behind a trusted uniform, sometimes behind an ordinary smile, and sometimes behind beliefs twisted into violence. Although each case unfolded differently, every one left behind grieving families, traumatized survivors, and communities forever changed by loss. The victims came from different walks of life, yet they all shared one heartbreaking reality: their futures were stolen far too soon. True crime often focuses on the killers, but history should never allow them to become the only names remembered. Behind every headline is a victim whose story deserves to be told with dignity and respect. As the headlines fade and documentaries end, the responsibility of remembering remains with all of us. Because justice is measured not only by convictions in a courtroom, but also by our willingness to remember those whose voices were permanently silenced. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never forget that the darkest stories are often the ones hidden just beneath the surface.